about their own apocalyptic histories on the plains. Sorry, it's a bad joke. It's hard to get it through their thick skulls. You know, so sorry. Anyway, sorry. Sorry for the bad joke. So maybe in response to Michael Roos's paper this morning, to give continuity to the set of papers today, he said to understand the present, you have to understand the past. Well, I would argue that also to understand the present, you have to understand the future, particularly imaginations of the future. And perhaps no present has been more future-oriented than our own, with the exception of maybe the Victorian era. And much of this future-oriented thought is characterized by cataclysm. The present age often seems driven by its images of its own end. Political scientists see violence-plagued anarchy, religious leaders condemn whole cultures and promise escapist prophecies. Hollywood movies draw upon each of these and repeatedly rehearse and sell them back to us, these visions of our end. This is the age of competing apocalypses. So I'll look at three broad sort of discourses. The first, American Evangelical, which we've talked about quite a lot at this conference. The second, loosely what I'll call secular public researchers, policymakers, eco-activists, and scientists. And then the third, radical social theorists. And at the end, I conclude with a provocation to debate by contrasting 6 principles as the core to what we might call a new radical apocalyptic. And we coin a phrase for the new revolutionary subject, or the emancipatory subject, the eco-precariat. So this paper was written in part in response to Eric Swingadow's characterization of contemporary apocalyptic discourses of environmental catastrophes as symptomatic of the post-political or a post-political condition. The post-political is a condition, or it's a situation in which consensus in populist politics displaces democratic antagonisms and reduces debates to questions of technocratic administration. So we have a manipulative elite politics and a consensual framing that reduces the possibility of a catastrophe to the calming certainty of a manageable crisis. It's going to be okay. Trust us. And this crisis response is to be overseen by popularly supported technocratic elites that claim they can solve any problem with solutions generated within the confines of contemporary capitalism, so long as democratic antagonisms are put on hold. So post-politics then is this foreclosure of democratically informed considerations of fundamental transformations in economic relations, but also society, nature relations, even amid impending ecological crisis. So seemingly contradictory then, the apocalypse becomes pro-capitalist, pro-status quo. And I'll go into how this happens in a moment. So we find considerable evidence. The evidence is largely lacking in many of Swingadow's papers, and so we provide some evidence to support him, but then we also find some evidence to critique him as well. We find he generalizes these apocalyptic environmental discourses as largely post-political and techno-managerial reductions of democracy and antagonism, and we add to that contestatory. So we find that some of these apocalyptic discourses are indeed post-political, some are also contestatory, and some are radical. So thus, among these 3 apocalyptic discourses, these here, we find a greater degree of heterogeneity, competition, polarization, and politicization than the characterization of post-political would suggest. So to begin with, evangelicals, American evangelicals largely. Many American evangelicals read the book of Revelation as the story of ecological catastrophe, right? A third part of the trees was burnt up, and all the trees and all the green grass was burnt up, right? So it is essential, given to criticism of Swingadow, however, to map up a much more varied analytical tapestry, not least to dispel assumptions about evangelicals as being all the same, as a supposedly homogeneous social bloc, completely of a post-political metaphysical fatalism. So we draw on 3 apocalyptic interpretations of climate change. And remember that in 2014, a recent survey suggested that 77% of American evangelicals feel that climate change is a sign of the end times. So this isn't marginal, and a good number of both progressive and more conservative evangelicals do put climate change into the category of end times sign. So the first is, environmental apocalypse is a sign of the end times or as a hoax. The second, environmental catastrophes is orchestrated by a vengeful God versus, an anthropogenic explanation. And C, the more radical perspective, an unveiling new ways of thinking about the world, right? new, different ways of organizing our world. So of the more fatalistic Christian right taking action to reverse this apocalyptic trend of polluting the environment is seen as a challenge to God's sovereignty because the ecological crisis is part of his divine end times plan. And to others, ecological catastrophes are seen as expressions of God's vengeance. So for example, the first quote, "The vengeful God, God's judgment for sins as diverse as the US government's sanction of Gaza's evacuation," so that's evacuation of Gush Katif, and in 2005, and New Orleans' decadent nightlife, right, were responsible for Hurricane Katrina. So this is why Hurricane Katrina came about, right? So you have increased, so a lot of climate scientists have suggested that on the American eastern seaboard, we'll see increased hurricanes number, but also the power of some of these hurricanes. And this was God's vengeance. And Jared captures this early writings of evangelical interpretations of climate change nicely. In 2004, he said, "Environmental crisis serves modern American conservative evangelists, just as natural disasters serve medieval millenarians, as a sign of the coming end, but not as a warning to avert it." So social and environmental reform is an act of then liberal Christianity that betrays the gospel, and these groups then welcome the atrocities of the world. And this is consistent with neoliberal capitalism's meritocratic, administrative, technological fix, only transcribed here as a metaphysical fatalism, right? There's nothing we can do to avert God's plan. It's predetermined, no worries, God has it under control. It's part of this apocalyptic narrative. Of the more contestatory, however, in the anthropogenic paradigm, Billy Graham, in his book Approaching Hoofbeats in 1983, one of the earliest prophetic texts that cites climate or environmental change, not quite climate change, he pretends that the tampering with nature has produced some side effects that have just begun to haunt us, and that the destruction prophesied by Jesus may have to do with man's poisoning of his environment through massive industrialization, right? So, this isn't, the Southern Baptist Convention in 1970 had made efforts to talk about stewardship of the environment. So this isn't that early, but this is the first real apocalyptic text that talks about it. Graham emphasizes environmental depopulation should be addressed as part of humanity's stewardship of the earth, thus taking a more pluralistic and egalitarian approach to unveiling aspects of the apocalypse to open our eyes to human-made environmental catastrophes, and therefore has attempted to repoliticize and democratize environmental apocalypses. So this is what we might call a contestatory discourse, right? It opens up discussion, democratization. It's not a foreclosed conclusion. No rapture is going to, it's just not just the rapture that's going to save you. You too can make an effort on the planet. So for him, there was no longer that cognitive security that everything will be all right in the end. And such an uncertain future meant evangelicals had to change the world to save themselves. And rather than fatalistically accept events as God's greater plan. And so, there are the sort of liberal voices within climate change, but, Katharine Hayhoe, she's a climate scientist at Texas Tech, and also an evangelical, and she wrote this book. She happens to be Canadian, however. She says, climate change is consistent with our ideology, consistent with our values, and consistent with being conservative, consistent with being a Christian, and even consistent with being the free market, or being with liking the free market and being a libertarian. So here again, she's very much supportive of neoliberal capitalism. She's taken a very conservative perspective. I would hesitate to put her into the contestatory, but she is arguing for a more democratic discussion. So taking up the latter concern of a more emancipatory change, religious scholars like Michael Northcott, Catherine Keller, and even Barbara Rosing have advocated a more radical reading of the Book of Revelation. And of course, this isn't new. Norman Cohen's The Pursuit of the Millennium, although not about environmental change, argued that these millennial movements can be profoundly revolutionary, of oppression and persecution, which could include environmental stresses. So reading Northcott and Keller, Joel Covell, who's the editor of Capitalism, Nature, Socialism, summarizes that these voices as illustrating a repoliticization and an emancipatory potential of the apocalypse within theological voices. He says, how can the environmental changes ahead be conceived of as enhancing society unless we recover the imaginative power of the apocalypse? So secular public researchers. So it is argued that much of the environmentalist literature is itself apocalyptic, what we would call secular apocalyptic. This is borrowing from Paul Boyer. So we begin with climate change policy officials. So Within the Republican Party, we have Marco Rubio, who's a Catholic. He says, I do not believe that human activity is causing these dramatic changes to our climate the way these scientists are portraying it. I do not believe that the laws the climate scientists propose we pass will do anything about it. Climate change, he means climate change, except it will destroy our economy. It's kind of a revealing moment, right? So basically he's saying it's not anthropocentric, it's part of this sort of natural cycle, right? It's a naturalized threat, and seemingly he wants to maintain this neoliberal status quo. Indeed, climate skeptics like free market think tanks, energy lobbyists, industry advocates, and senators connected to this complex stand to gain from things like the Northwest Passage being opened up or drill bits in the Arctic. And among federal legislatures like John Shimkus, he's a Lutheran, said in 2010. So in other words, I talked at the beginning about evangelicals, and here I'm talking about policymakers, and they're not mutually exclusive. They overlap in certain ways. John Shimkus is one of those. He basically said that the earth will end only when God declares it to be over. And James Einhoff, one of the more famous detractors of climate change, said climate change is simply a hoax, and he wrote a book about it. But you see this within Democrats as well. So Barbara Boxer, she's quoted recently as saying, time is running out. She's the California senator, concerning global warming. And she is an attempt to repoliticize environmental issues through a kind of apocalyptic psychological imminence, right? That we need to do something now or the end is upon us, or at least the status quo. Among eco-activists, and in a way, James Lovelock was quoted earlier, and I would say he did back into this one. He says, we need a more authoritarian world. We've become a sort of cheeky egalitarian world where everyone can have their say. And he concluded, it may be necessary to put democracy on hold for a while. So here he's advocating an anti-democratic and authoritarian rule to prevent an environmental apocalypse. He's very much falling into the kind of technocratic, post-political discourse about an environmental apocalypse. Among more eco-activists, the contestatory discourses, we looked at Greenpeace. They've attacked specific forms of industrial production that threaten the reproduction of life, but Greenpeace is a light green reformist group working within capitalism and does well to identify the foundational dynamics of environmental problems, but does little to work to change them. As Wapner summarizes here, advertisement does not affect or change the structures of power which create and support environmental destruction. So still within these popular researchers, we have these books, The End of Nature by Bill McKibben, more recently Elizabeth Colbert's The Sixth Extinction, which was talked about earlier, a little older, Jared Diamond's Collapse, but also Robert Kaplan's The Coming Anarchy, Guy McPherson's Near-Term Extinction, these kinds of discourses. And they all parallel this Cold War systems theory come apocalyptic language from Tom Schilling, right? This kind of tipping points, or points of no return, Richard Ashley calls them, or critical thresholds, or omega points, right? And these kind of echo for evangelical, if we look at it through a kind of evangelical lens, it's very similar to the rapture, right? We're on the sort of precipice of some large event. In one case, in the rapture case, however, you're saved. In this case, there's no millennium to save you. So the immediacy of these apocalyptic effects of climate change has the effect of persuasion and simultaneously, and as we heard earlier, instilling anxiety and fear, a kind of paralysis, as it was called. But some climate scientists want to limit the fallout related to this apocalyptic potentiality through their findings, but they're often limited or hamstrung to do so, and I think this was put very well in Orksey's and Conway's article in Daedalus. It's only 5 minutes, so I better cruise forward then. All right. Further, Naomi Klein summarizes this post-political condition. She says, climate scientists, in order to appear reasonable within neoliberal economic circles, scientists have been dramatically soft-pedaling the implications of their research. And at the American Geophysicists Union Conference, one of the audience members asked, is Earth fucked? And he answered, well, if we're thinking about the future of the Earth and if the future of our coupling of the environment, we need to include human resistance to capitalism as part of the dynamics. That is really a geophysics problem. Wait, challenging capitalism is a geophysics problem. And therefore, not all apocalyptic thought is necessarily post-political. Werner's position is quite radical and even anti-capitalist. Of social theorists, they have turned toward apocalyptic rhetoric to rethink the emancipatory messages of religious discourses, to serve an effective tool to emphasize an ecological critique of capitalism, and to opportunistically marshal the forces of various apocalyptic scenarios as possible substitutes for the vanquished revolutionary subject. The most important radical theorist to do this really is Slavoj Žižek. And he gives the reasons for these various apocalyptic trends within climate change. And he argues that revolutionaries have to wait very patiently for the usually very brief moment when the system openly malfunctions or collapses. And we have to exploit the window of opportunity to seize power. And he's suggesting that capitalism can't abide the challenges that climate change will present. In other words, it will have to function. It'll have to malfunction. And these kind of radical apocalyptic politics must bring plans for a proletarian upheaval, what we call an eco-precariat, those of the poor of the world, those aboriginals of the world, into closer contact with secular ecologism, thereby conceiving the threat of annihilation as the chance for a radical emancipatory renewal. Just to conclude then, we have some, in this paper, I'm just going forward because I don't have time now, post-political dimensions of apocalyptic discourse identified by Swingadao indeed operate in many contemporary apocalyptics by evangelical, secular eco-activists and scientists. And these discourses have a strong tendency to craft visions of the future that cast events as being decidedly beyond democratic debate. And such discourses depicted as naive and hopeless to those who would attempt to raise fundamental questions about our present political and economic systems. An awareness of these discourses as heterogeneous and not just post-political, but also contestatory and unexpectedly full of radical potential is necessary. In other words, we need to create new collectivities around these rather than simply identifying and eschewing certain groups as post-political. And a new radical apocalyptic paradigm is emerging. So as a provocation to debate, we identify 6 principles we consider to be a core for a new radical apocalyptic. 1, that it's earthly. A progressive apocalyptics must reject any transcendental claims or expectations. There is no God in this scenario, no savior, no teleological forces determining the shape and impact of the apocalypse. And the apocalypse is above all an earthly event. And the matter and forces of the earth alone must be seen as the causes, conditions, and consequences and responses of the apocalypse. We must insist on a materialist perspective, right? The stakes are not soul, salvation, heaven, and metaphysical purpose, but bodies, brains, pleasure, projects, and earthly justice. The second, immanent in the Kantian sense. However imminent the most catastrophic events may be, the apocalypse is profoundly immanent to our present situation. The apocalypse is ahead of us, it's also upon us, it's behind us, it's within us, and the forces contributing to impending ecological, economic, and social catastrophe already operate in and profoundly shape the present. Recognition of this immanence can sharpen our sense of complicity, responsibility, and potential. The third, contingency. We must refuse any claim of access to divine knowledge or absolutely unassailable objective truths. Our materialism is grounded in a radical contingency, i.e., a foundational unpredictability that means things can have been different and can always be different, not predetermined predestination or participation in an already scripted revelation. Fourth, conjunctural, or this is what Christian Parenti calls catastrophic convergence. The apocalypse includes political, economic, teleological, technological, and ecological dimensions of causes. An appreciation of these multiple dimensions of a composite apocalypse is crucial for considering the contingency of the unfolding of any apocalypse, the diverse causal pathways of its production, the opportunity, indeed the need for large-scale, multidimensional socio-ecological transformations. And 5, uneven. This is the geographical element. Different places and different places are impacted and will be impacted differently. The poor suffer most, again, what we call the eco-precariat. And the apocalypse is overcoated by class divisions and inequality. The radical apocalypticism intent on earthly justice requires an awareness and emphasis on the geographical and social unevenness in the causes and consequences of the apocalypse. Our expectations, plans, and demands must reflect this awareness. And lastly, redemptive. The apocalypse contains unprecedented transformative potential. All efforts to reduce the catastrophe to an apocalypse, to an event locatable and thus solvable within the coordinates of present systems of power and profit should be subverted. And the apocalypse is an opportunity to transform everything. And we should see the apocalypse as the possibility for redemption. And that's it. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Tristan. Questions for Tristan?
Just a request, Tristan, since you had to rush through that and you skipped over a slide that had lots of interesting stuff, can the transcript of this be made available on the site as well as just the...
I think they record these on YouTube, so you should be able to see it on YouTube.
Well,
all of the slides.
but since you had to skip some, can the transcript of the paper be made available?
You want to email me, I'll send it to you. I'd happily send it to you.
Someone can have that.
My name is Tristan Sturm. You just type me into Google and you can find my email that way.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for that. I just have a question. Perhaps I've misinterpreted something you've said, but certainly in your wrap-up, you did imply with the six things about, that final slide, the contingency, the unpredictability. You often seem to contrast that with, say, ideas of a divine script, and you're saying, we've got to recognise, in fact, that things are contingent, that things, people are capable of making choices. I just wonder if that's slightly caricaturing religious notions of both the apocalypse and related phenomenon, that they are often conditional. There's a whole prophetic tradition of a conditionality about these things, that this will happen unless you do X, Y, and Z.
Right,
that rather than assuming that necessarily the contingency and conditionality and all that sort of stuff is an entirely secular way of thinking about it. I don't know if you feel that's a fair criticism, but even in the Book of Revelation, some people's experience of the apocalypse is determined upon how they've responded to certain things. So it's agency is always there, even if there's a script.
But yeah, I think there are certain within premillennial dispensationalism, for example, there's this almost codified set of relations and how the end is planned out, and it seems like. Depending on the period in which you're reading some of these, whether it's Hal Lindsey in the Cold War, or whether it's Mark Hitchcock after 1995, these change quite drastically about who Gog and Magog are going to be and who the big leaders are going to destroy Israel. But there's been sort of common narrative, I think, for at least 130 years, or maybe a little bit less than that, maybe 100 years, where it's already set out. It's not contingent at all. This is what's going to happen. These are your common enemies. These are those social groups that are your enemies, and these are the states that will be the enemy in the end. And so what I mean here what we mean here by contingency is that there is no utopian plan for the future, but rather it's negotiated, it's democratic, and it comes about along with the material conditions in which that series of events happens to manifest in an apocalypse. But again, the apocalypse isn't, if we go down to the uneven part, it's not a universal apocalypse. It doesn't happen globally. It happens different places at different times. And as Graham spoke of earlier, Graham Harvey, sorry, at different times as well. So I think that's my point, is that there's no one plan. And I think when people start planning for these things, certain individuals end up being left out, and it becomes a kind of post-political condition or circumstances in which democratic antagonisms are not incorporated within the discussion. Yeah.
Any other questions for Tristan? Okay, let's move on. Thanks, Tristan.